Who Deserves a Home? Systemic Housing Barriers by Marika McIntosh, Rebecca Smith, and Renita Verma. A frontline worker was grappling with an issue that had arisen while working with a client who had been part of their caseload for the past 8 months. Initially, at the beginning of their working relationship, the client was in great distress, seeing as she required immediate assistance to find shelter for both her and her children. The client, a Black Muslim woman, had recently immigrated to Canada and was experiencing domestic violence. During the initial connection between the worker and client, a female interpreter abruptly ended the phone call without providing any context as to why, further exacerbating this client's distress. Although communication was difficult due to language barriers, a new interpreter was found to facilitate the exchange of information between the client and the worker. Though the worker, with their experience, felt it was odd that the new interpreter was male, especially seeing that he would be providing service for a newly arrived woman seeking gender-based violence support. The worker recognized that this could be triggering for the client, but since they were navigating limited resources, the client interpreter and the worker continued to work together to assist the client in securing shelter for herself and her family. Despite challenges with appointments and relying on the male interpreter, the worker maintains that they and the client had a good working relationship for several months. During their initial in-person meeting, the client was able to visit the worker's office and secure some necessities, as well as confirm a housing application. Special housing applications are executed by a worker writing an advocacy letter to the city that corroborates indicators of abuse the client has experienced. This part of the application is 5 pages long, in addition to the mandatory advocacy letter. In time, the client and her children were placed in temporary housing and relocated into what's known as the Hotel Overflow System. This program, run through a handful of social service agencies across the city, aims to catch families when the regular shelters are already at capacity. Funded by the municipal government, the program is designed to be a safety net. However, due to lack of funding and an overwhelming need, these types of programs are severely limited, meaning that the staff are few and far between and have limited resources available, leaving individuals or their families with far less help than they desperately need. Early in the summer, the client received a housing offer from a social housing provider. Social housing is a government-assisted rental housing program that provides support for individuals and families with low to moderate incomes, seniors, or those with special needs. The worker accompanied the client and her children to view the unit being offered. The client later declined the offer because it was too far for her eldest son's liking. The worker wondered why she was basing this decision on his feelings, especially while she was experiencing dire circumstances. The worker wondered why someone in such dire circumstances would deny a brand new unit with new appliances in a building with a backyard and in a good part of town. The worker knew they would need to speak with housing again to try to explain these very unique circumstances of the housing refusal. Due to the client's refusal to accept this offered unit, the shelter system assigned her a discharge date from the hotel program, as denying the available unit was not in compliance with the program's requirements. At this point, the client and her children had the discharge date from the hotel program with nowhere to go. The client requested access to the second stage housing she had previously denied, as her son also disliked that space. Second stage units are available for individuals who've spent time in the shelter and whose situations are deemed somewhat more stable, allowing them to live independently while waiting for their social housing offer. Stays within the second stage programs last between 12 and 15 months. When the client learned that the second stage housing was no longer available, the client, in complete distress, refused to leave the worker's office. To assist the client, the worker accompanied her to the city housing office to advocate for her reactivation on the housing list with the special priority rather than starting over. In certain jurisdictions within Canada, declining a, quote, suitable rent-geared housing unit results in the applicant's file being cancelled, after which the client must submit a new application, losing their original spot and being placed at the very bottom of the waiting list, which is currently up to 10 years long. Despite the rules of social housing, the worker and client successfully reactivated the client on the housing waitlist. The worker believes this happened due to the compassion shown by the housing worker that day, who could see the extreme distress the client was experiencing regarding the circumstances. Together, the worker and client were able to find a market rent unit that the client said she could afford. This was especially important as the discharge date from the hotel overflow program was approaching. Meanwhile, the worker continued to advocate and reached out to numerous landlords, ultimately securing a building that was willing to rent to the client. Luckily, because a unit had been secured, the shelter program granted an extension, allowing the client to remain until her move was made. These initiatives are programs that will enable renters to access below-market rent in Toronto, such as the Housing Now initiative and the Open Door program. Additionally, commercial rent and supplemental programs, as well as the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit, offer subsidies for existing market units. The worker noticed that while this new unit was being secured, the client's son again had misgivings about living there. However, due to the circumstances, the client expressed that she was hopeful that he would change his mind. A lease was signed, and a deposit for the first and last month's rent was given to secure the unit. When the moving date arrived, the worker and client found it to be quite stressful. When the worker arrived, boxes were not packed, and it dawned on them that the client had never experienced a move before, let alone one that she would be managing with children. Unfortunately, the male interpreter, despite being booked, decided not to attend the session on the day of the move. The worker had suspicions that this was due to his comments over the last few sessions being difficult to conduct because the client also had to manage her baby. Without the interpretation support, there was an added layer of stress for both the client and the worker on the day of her move-in. The worker believes that the client continued to experience additional problems once they were settled into the new unit, as the building management kept calling the worker. Unfortunately, because the client was no longer communicating with the worker, they were unable to consent to discuss any issues that may have arisen with the woman's tenancy. Thank you for watching.